The musical has been performed by a number of American regional theater companies and made its New York City debut in January 2008 at Carnegie Hall with Harvey Keitel starring as Jerry.
Okay. Wow. Welcome to Cult Favorite, the podcast that makes good toast and where we don't fight. I'm Merinda Simmons.
And I'm Mike Altman. We are two religious studies professors trying to understand all of these cult documentaries that you can't stop binge watching. And if you want to support the show and help more people find us, you can follow us on all of the socials at Cult Favorite Pod. And also be sure to subscribe to the show and leave us a rating and a review.
Today we're going into the 90s and talking Jerry Springer, fights, camera, action on Netflix, a 2-part series. And it made me really think about the category of a content warning in its own right, because like the whole show is a content warning. And so, you know, there are lots of things that probably we might identify as things to be on the listen out for.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Yeah.
It's Jerry Springer, everybody. We're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about why we're talking about this show in general?
I mean, it was your idea. So
I was trying to set you up for like.
I mean, I think.
Because really, I feel like Mr. McMahon was the gateway conversation.
Yeah.
To.
Which is coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
But that was your idea.
That was my idea. But I think.
Or was that my idea? You tried to get me to watch that. And then I said, that should be an episode.
I said, try to watch this.
So maybe this is all on me.
I said, try to watch this. Feel free to just stop at any point.
That's right. It wasn't toward the, I don't think it was toward the podcast though. I think that maybe.
Yeah. And then.
I'll take the blame.
But I do think that both of these, but the Springer one, and we'll get to McMahon, but the Springer one is, I think it's actually different reasons for each. I think that the Springer one, for me, is interesting for us to talk about because the Springer show was its own kind of cult documentary. So this is almost like the documentary of a kind of documentary in the way that Springer was all about these people that are definitely not me, but I'm going to watch them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the...
And nominally... with the veneer of like getting their story told.
Yes. Yeah. Solving their problems.
So while cult is never actually mentioned in this documentary, I think that there are a lot of through lines and connections that we might make that link up to the kinds of things we've been talking about.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I think it was worth I mean, if you put I think it's one of those things where it was on Netflix. And so it's worth our time and to think about these documentaries. If it's not a true crime, it's almost like a true media kind of thing that I think fits a lot of the same conventions.
But then that is its own. It's sort of like a content warning. I mean, it in a different from a different perspective could absolutely be a true crime because we do learn about a murder trial that arguably would never have happened.
Yeah.
If the show were not what it was.
I don't know. I have questions about that narrative.
Yep.
I have questions about the causality.
Sure.
But
culpability
But those questions about harm that we keep coming back to are the same in lots of ways.
Totally. Okay, so what did you know about Jerry Springer, the man, the myth, the legend?
I remember when Springer was at its height of popularity. I would get home from school. I don't know if it was when I get home from school or if it was in the summer, but I remember flipping by it, especially during the part of my life where we didn't have cable because it was on, or we had like the cable package that only went up to like 20. So it was there. I probably paused on it a few times, but it was definitely understood as like something like we don't watch in the household. So there's also something transgressive about that moment.
Not but the fact in the Altman household.
Right. But the fact that it was on at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So that was my experience of it.
All right.
I didn't realize how long it was on the air.
Until 2018.
Yeah.
So It was a total cultural presence, and so I was very much aware of it. It never really appealed to me, which is not to say anything about me or it, except that just, I don't know. I think that there are a lot of media phenomena that I just kind of understand as not made for me.
Right.
Like I think I have a for better or worse, a sense of my own occupancy among a demographic and like the space that I live in inside of that lane. So my middle school class, though, did take a field trip once to be in the audience of a daytime talk show.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Which one?
Okay, so in my head, it was Joan London.
Okay.
But I don't feel like that can be true. I tried to do a little bit of like searching of did she record a daytime talk show in Tampa, Florida at any point? Or maybe we went to St. Petersburg. I'm not sure. I think it was downtown Tampa, but that can't be right. That can't. I don't.
This has got to be Googleable.
I don't
was
know.
recording in Tampa?
I know. Anyway,
Wow.
so I was in the audience of a daytime talk show at one time in my life when I was a tween.
Where did Ricky Lake record?
Well, I don't know, but she was later, I think.
Okay.
Wasn't she? I don't know. I don't know, man. I am not a connoisseur, an aficionado of daytime talk TV.
Daytime talk show connoisseur.
No, but I do think that its history and evolution are really fascinating. And I think that they say a lot about American society in all sorts of ways. Here's the synopsis for Jerry Springer Fights Camera Action.
What a great title. Let's just say what a great title.
Sure. So we get it's only 2 episodes, which I think was cool to both of us. We were both pleased that this was
no
not
padding.
like
There's no padding here.
So we get an initial shock to the system that the show came to be known for. You know, we see a clip of a guy who's married to a horse and white supremacists in KKK robes giving Nazi salutes, which at the time, you know, felt really far out there.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. Is that a simpler time? We also hear various descriptions of the show. So the inception of American shock culture is what somebody calls it. Somebody else calls it chaos, but then somebody else calls it genius, the modern version of a Roman Colosseum. And we get that later too, where you'll kind of like skip between different people who call it trash and then horrible, but then brilliant. You know, it's all of those things at once. And the show really brought those extremes playing off of each other into the mainstream. So we learn about Jerry's background, early 90s Chicago. He had come there to launch a talk show, but before then, which I guess I didn't realize, I knew that he was like adjacent, like he lived adjacently to the political realm.
Yeah.
But he was the mayor of Cincinnati for a year in the late 70s and had a successful, you know, for some years, a career as like an anchor and commentator in news outlets. But he comes to Chicago, he starts a show. It is initially very blah. So turning point 1 comes when, like, facing threat of being canceled, Richard Dominic comes in as executive producer. Richard Dominic is someone that we do hear from quite a bit in the documentary, often holding a cigar. He's got a background in tabloids. He's wearing sunglasses. Like he's a type. And he comes in to be executive producer on the show and has the view that the show should be interesting with the sound off. So initially what that meant was like women taking their tops off and, you know, lots of things that were going to, you know, appealing to young Mike, who would pause for a moment for nudity purposes. Yes. The executives were not happy, but, you know, ratings talk. So now that it's not going to be canceled, they want to see how far they can take the show. The trajectory, thus, is one of like unassuming storytelling to, you know, fight-fueled phenomenon with 2 counterparts at the helm. So we've got like Jerry Springer on one end, who is this non-judgmental sweetheart dad figure that people really go to lengths throughout both episodes to protect in some way, to say like, if he thought he was doing harm, he'd never do the show. If he
Right.
Oprah gave us a hard time, but he's the best. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. We can maybe talk about that. But then on the other end of that spectrum, but working very much in tandem, is Richard Dominic. So he's, then the evil genius of this executive with lots of demands, but zero boundaries. And so the interplay of that juxtaposition is really part of what made the show work. Richard is presented very much as our kind of trope of charismatic leader who has to approve everything that any employee ever did and makes them work these 14-hour days, 6 days a week, and so on and so on.
Has some kind of creative genius that's, that he's able to use.
Yes. And so there is this second turning point where there's an episode. So he's getting increasingly dramatic with his storylines, but an episode brings on KKK members together with Irv Rubin, who was at the time the chairman of the Jewish Defense League. If you do not know who Irv Rubin is, there's a rabbit hole for you later. He would later get arrested on conspiracy charges upon discovery of, plans to bomb a mosque and stuff. So he's so like the show would do this a lot, bringing people in for a confrontation, but it really began with this episode.
Yeah.
Fist fight ensues, ratings soar. So now that's the new bar. Clanfrontation. And so that's the bar to meet. We hear from several of the producers on the show whose job really was to amp up, to find these stories, but then to amp up the guests and then get them basically to fight. Because once you have that clanfrontation, now every single episode is trying to kind of reproduce that same that same excitement by virtue of like physical conflict. So, so then you have something called getting springered, which means being produced. The backlash is multifaceted. You've got moralistic backlash from, protests calling the show trash. Oprah gets involved once their show bests her in the ratings. One of the producers, Toby, his dad was Akira Yoshimura, who was a longtime producer on SNL. I think that he's still working there. I don't know.
Oh, really? Wow.
I think that he was there
Who's the art director or
production designer.
Production designer, yeah.
He was there from 1975, and I think that, anyway, but whatever. He's a long-time employee on SNL, and he tells Toby that, what you do is not TV.
Oof.
It's, but then there's also some backlash about, like, people, admitting that some of the fights are fake. That question of what's real, what's fake, and that's really kind of what is going to then, I think, segue us into a conversation next time about Mr. McMahon.
Yeah.
But this idea of what's authentic, what's genuine, what's sincere in relation to what is produced and what is fake and inauthentic is really, it becomes this very messy relationship on this show. And I think that that's probably part of what made it so successful, because that line gets really blurry. So then there's a third turning point, another episode called Secret Mistress Confronted, which I guess on its face doesn't sound all that controversial in the spectrum of Springer episodes.
Right.
But Nancy Campbell, a single mom of two, comes on to be a guest. She thinks it's to get back with her ex, Ralph, but she meets instead his new girlfriend, Eleanor, who confronts Nancy and tries to pick a fight. Nancy won't have it. She leaves, but she kind of is there under false pretenses. The show does not check in with her, make sure she's okay. She leaves and later is murdered. Ralph, kills her and gets a life sentence for second-degree murder in 2002. So after we hear about that show and the fallout of that, like, fourth and last turning point, lawyers get real nervous after his murder trial, as I guess makes sense. They start censoring.
Well, and they moved the show to Jamaica for a special to try to avoid getting subpoenaed.
I mean, yeah, Toby would say that's exactly what Jamaica was the case. Richard denies this. Yeah. After 2002, like, they have a handful of years where they're getting increasingly censored or just kind of reined in. Yeah. Richard would call it censored, such that in 2008, he finally leaves. And by his rendering, the show goes into a total rut. But it lasted another 10 years. Yeah. After that, we hear from Jerry toward the end saying, like, that the show was super embarrassing. He's going to hell. Like, and TV Guide names it the worst show of all time.
I find that hard to believe.
But it paved the way for so much TV that we know and love today. And then, Jerry died in 2023, worth approximately $60 million. And that's where it closes. Yeah. That's the documentary about the rise and not fall of the show, but more like the rise of the show and what came in its wake.
Yeah, because they don't, the show's on the air until 2018 before it gets canceled, but they don't really discuss the, like, slow denouement. It's just sort of once Richard leaves, and then the show fades from the public discussion. There's lots of other things replacing it. Also, we're just not in that mode. Like, there's something about late 90s, early 2000s cultural reaction.
Yep.
That's going on here too.
Totally. So, I mean, what I wanted to hear more about was, we get passing mention of something called the Springer Triangle.
Yeah.
The Springer Triangle. This is a geospatial region from, like, Ohio, Tennessee, Georgia. Like, if you draw a triangle between those states, that is what the producers say is where 75% of the guests apparently came from. There's mention of this, but there's not any real examination of that. There's talk of, like, how these guests would get picked up in a big city by a limo, and that just blew their minds. And then how they were beholden to those producers for, like, just even the fares back home. Yeah. They needed to get back home from Chicago. And that was not something that they could take for granted. So we hear a little bit about, like, these are people in poverty who come on to tell their stories. One of the producers say that many of them were very much doing so in earnest, and that they really felt like they were going to be able to solve some of those problems.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'm thinking yet again of the conditions that make a social phenomenon possible. So at least a primary element in this case is poverty in parts of Appalachia and the Deep South. So, like, Richard says at one point that the show is so successful because it's an escape for people, like, from the regular life. You have to pay your bills, and you have to go to the store, and the children are a pain, and the job is a bummer. And so you watch the show as some kind of escape. But that escape, and sure, but that escape comes very much at the expense of people who have it worse.
Yeah.
And that's gross. Because then it's like, it's not about the stories they have to tell, which is what the production narrative is, that we're bringing on people to tell their stories. And that's what Jerry said at the very beginning of his own kind of trajectory as well. It's not about those stories, though. It's not about the problems that they want to solve. It's like you were saying a bit ago, like, it's a fun trip to the zoo again for the audience. And this is true for guests from Appalachia, but it's also true for trans guests and others as well. Like, that, bringing on trans people as some kind of big reveal, I just...
Yeah.
So
that was Yeah.
But so there wasn't really a lot of analysis though about that. It was there were the documentary definitely tries to cue into the question of where exploitation starts and stops, but that is very much a question put to producers and showmakers. We hear from one guest. We get one guest interviewed,
yes, exactly.
which I think is fascinating.
Which
is a choice. It's just a choice.
It can't be hard. It can't be that hard. No,
of course not.
So to your point about like the trans guests and all that, there was a New York Times interview with the director of the documentary, Luke Sebel, and it had sort of there's like 5 takeaways from the documentary. And one of the takeaways I thought was so weird in the article was the show was an inadvertent positive for queer people, with the argument that somehow like having queer people on the show was a plus when they were like invisible in the rest of like late 90s culture, which would seem like such an ass backwards argument.
I mean, maybe there is a space inside of queer life where Jerry Springer reigns supreme that I'm just not privy to.
Yeah.
Because again, like I
don't think there. Yeah.
I'm very much in that demographic, but not in Springer's. So I don't know. I guess there is definitely like where I guess I could see that playing is some sort of mainstreamification of camp.
Right.
But I do think that this is where a lot of those generic constraints start to crop up, because I think, for example, what John Waters does with his art and films is very different from what Jerry Springer show does.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you've got Divine like eating shit in a John Waters movie. So it's but then the reason that those two things are really different becomes, I guess, the question. And so it's not that there is anyway.
I'll put a link to the article in the notes, but it was just, I was like, that was a weird takeaway from so some things that I saw that they left out that I found out later. One, there, and I think I might have actually, I think I was reminded of this when I found it, but there was a whole series of like Too Hot for TV pay-per-views that they did at the height of the show. So there was a piece of this of like the just ringing this for all it was worth.
Sure.
At its height. And that raises questions of like, no pun intended, the overexposure of the show.
Yeah.
As part of the reason for it's, you can only shock so much, and if you're relying on the shock factor, and then you're doing it, get our pay-per-view. And I'd be very fascinated to know what the pay-per-view buys were for that. But the other thing, I didn't know where else to put this in our show, but I wanted to make sure we commented on it.
Okay.
So I'm going to put it here, is that there was a Jerry Springer the Opera. Jerry Springer the Opera, this is from the Wikipedia page for it.
Okay.
Is a British musical written by Richard Thomas and Stuart Lee based on the talk show Jerry Springer. It contains irreverent treatment of Christian themes, extensive profanity, and surreal images such as a troupe of tap dancing Ku Klux Klan members. The musical ran for 609 performances in London from April 2003 to February 2005 before touring the UK in 2006. It won 4 Laurence Olivier Awards, including Best New Musical. And the first North American performance was at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. The musical has been performed by a number of American regional theater companies and made its New York City debut in January 2008 at Carnegie Hall with Harvey Keitel starring as Jerry.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
I don't know. That's all.
I mean, it is. I certainly, well, like, we should not pretend that we are somehow above or removed from the like obvious appeal of this show.
Right.
And so I'm interested too, which is going to be some of our conversational bridge between now and a couple of weeks from now too, of like what you find really compelling about wrestling that you don't find compelling about Jerry Springer, and vice versa. Like what it is that you think works in one context that you don't think works in another. But I think that's, I guess, from my own perspective, like what I'm saying about John Waters movies and stuff, of like where I might see exploitation on the Jerry Springer show is something. It's not because it's obscene or base, or like the moralizing arguments against it were kind of an eye roll.
100%.
And the this is not respectable, and this is not what, I mean, Oprah saying that like this isn't good TV, whatever. Like, I don't know. I thought that was all kind of a snooze. Like, I get the appeal.
Yeah.
It's just what that appeal comes courtesy of. Like, what is the cost of that appeal?
Yeah.
There's always a cost to it. There's always something that makes possible the thing.
What do you want to talk about? Or do you want me to talk about what I want to talk about?
Talk about what you want to talk about. I talked about a lot of things that I want to talk about.
I will say,
I snuck them into the summary.
Because I don't actually know if we'll get here or not if we talk about Mr. McMahon. So I do want to say there was a lot of pro wrestling references dropped in the documentary about Jerry Springer. And to your point, so Springer did appear in WWE a couple times and all this, but and Vince Russo, who was a WWF writer in the 90s, and then eventually became the writer at WCW, the competition, and actually part of the reason they went out of business because he was very bad at this, has said he came up with the idea of Crash TV, which was similar to Richard Dominic in that he's thinking you have this Monday Night War between WCW and WWF. Their shows are on the exact same time every Monday night. And he's like, people are just waiting for an excuse to turn the channel to the other show. And if they do that, I'll lose them. So something new has to happen over and over again. I found that because I was like, I didn't watch WWF. Then he gets hired by WCW and he tanks my little wrestling show that I love so much with his Crash TV. And so it's funny when you say like what appeals to me about Springer, or doesn't appeal to me about Springer, but appeals about wrestling. It was the Springerification of wrestling that ruined it for me.
Interesting.
That sort of destroyed what I liked. And so by 2001, the company I grew up watching was gone, and I stopped watching wrestling after they went out of business until about 5 years ago.
Interesting.
Right. So there's it was the Springerification and that Crash TV thing that was like not at all what I wanted. And so
because you feel like it messed with the art form or something, or what was because I don't think that there's anything. I guess the reason that the moralistic backlash is also just kind of an eye roll for me is that I don't think that there was anything like pure about American society that then got like someone calls it at one point, the show, an abomination of American culture or something.
Right.
I mean, I think it's an extension of American culture is like amplified. It's an amplification of American culture, perhaps.
Yes, it is actually putting a microscope in multiple ways.
Yeah.
On
so many of our biases.
So many parts of American culture.
Yeah. So what did it mess with that you thought?
It's the same thing that made Springer that it was the same shelf life that the Springer show had of if you just keep doing ridiculous thing, and at the cost of sort of long-term storytelling or at the cost of, athletic matches, then it just becomes nonsensical.
But then why do you find kayfabe interesting and worth thinking about so much?
Well, I think kayfabe, as in like the fictional world of wrestling, and also the movement between what is real and what is not, that is interesting because that's the piece, I guess, that Springer and wrestling shared. That is, I think, a general thing we often find pleasurable, which is there's pleasure in trying to be in the know. And so one way to watch Springer is to be like, I know this is all fake. I know that these people aren't really this isn't really happening. And so I'm like the I'm different than there's an imagined other audience. There's always an imagined other who's getting fooled.
Yeah.
But I'm not. And that's part of how wrestling works. And that's part of how wrestling worked in the 90s in particular, because you had these storylines that tried to mess around with what was happening backstage and what was not. So that I can see, but we get that in all sorts of places. Like, we get that in celebrity culture. I mean, it's the more I think about kayfabe, the more I'm seeing it as a kind of form of kind of like Marxist ideology in a lot of ways.
Well, sure. What I guess is, I guess what part of what I'm trying to grapple with is, in wrestling, what you were just talking about, which makes a lot of sense to me, is a kind of, the audience is in on the joke.
Yeah.
Like, we're all suspending disbelief. So belief isn't really part of the point. It's all this narrative.
Yeah.
But then with Springer, I think that very suspension is what made people ignore what became characters and caricatures as real people, as people with lives that, were more than their appearance for 45 minutes on the show, that were people who could live and die, who were people who didn't get some kind of salary by virtue of their humiliation.
Yeah.
So there's, like, I think that maybe that's right, what you said about, like, they are an audience who is looking at what's happening on the Springer stage and saying that's all fake. But and that's why there's so much, like, it's funny, I mean, people are laughing and they're freaking out, and it's all this, like, like, I mean, he says at one point that he's not doing a talk show. Well, like, Oprah does a talk show. I do a circus.
I do a circus.
And so, as, like, when you go to the circus, it is this kind of transportation into a world where things that weren't possible seem possible. But in the process, I think what gets lost is any kind of sensibility about or connection to the people who are on the stage as people.
Yeah, they're just cartoon characters.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you've got, I mean, at its peak, the show, when it was beating Oprah, the show had 8 million viewers, which is huge for a daytime show. And in 2018, it had 1.7 million.
Interesting.
So I think you can think about the audience in terms of the way you get 8 million is you have a huge audience who is imagining that the 1.7 millions are all rubes, right? And so there's this difference between your base audience who might think that it is somewhat real or are, I don't know, versus the people who can, to make something so mainstream or so popular, it has to have, and yet to be so ridiculous, it has to have some measure of remove the audience can make. I think, to make that was key to the popularity. And like Jerry's entire, like, he was such the perfect straight man in the comedy routine.
Yeah, totally.
And that allowed everyone else, like, for Jerry Springer to be so vanilla and so avuncular, that is what makes it possible for the audience to see themselves as him, and the studio audience as well, right? Their reactions, such that there's that distance between the fact that Jerry's not on stage with them. Jerry's always out in the audience walking around with his cue cards, right? He's literally off stage.
No, totally.
Right. And so I think that was super important to the formula, because it did allow those people on the stage to remain, like cartoon characters, caricatures, and not, and there was no, there's no storyline to a Jerry Springer show, right? There's no long-term, they're not following people for weeks or anything.
Right.
And so I think that was a key, that was both the what made it work, but also what gave it such an expiration date.
It seems too, though, that, like, I don't know that, I don't want to say that it stopped. I mean, everything has, even MASH can only last so long, I think that part of the reason that Jerry Springer stopped being a show was also because of what it made possible. I mean, by the time 2008 rolls around, when it gets canceled, Real Housewives is a couple of years into its own franchise. You've got other reality shows and the kinds of things that that it made possible as a piece of culture inside of shock media was something that now was able to take off. I guess I don't see it as something that stopped being popular so much as it ran its course and has a shelf life like anything, and what came in its wake was just this huge empire.
But yeah, and there was a part in the documentary where they talk about this, sort of what it made possible afterwards, and they have all these clips from like these Bravo shows. If you see what those shows did, they have fully fleshed characters in a way. Like they're telling a story over the whole season. And the fans of those shows feel a connection to those,
that's a good point.
To those women in those shows.
Right.
Even something like The Bachelor or Love is Blind or whatever, which is not based around like the same kind of fighting that like a Real Housewives arguments or whatever. But all of these things are built around people on those shows who are building their own individual brand as a kind of reality star,
right,
in hopes of doing multiple shows,
right.
And so there's a real difference. So yes, I think a lot of the production techniques that that we hear from the producers of Jerry Springer are the same ones used by producers of The Bachelor or a lot of these shows to get, you're going to go in there and you're going to tell him you love him. Like we need you, you can, there's a great book, Bachelor Nation, that talks about all this. So I think that's true. But I think and maybe it wasn't as true 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but I think now we're all sort of in on it in a way that, like, if you go on a reality show, if you're a Mormon wife in The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, you kind of know what you're signing up for in a way that the guests on Springer didn't. And you get to be, you're building a brand as a public figure in a way that they are not.
And it sounded very much based on what the producers were talking about, and then the clips that we would see of them working with guests, producing them prior to recording, was that the conversations that they were having with the guests were an attempt to engage the guest in what the guest thought was good faith.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like there was a kind of, how do you feel about so-and-so's feelings, and how can you, whatever, like they would do like role play and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But there was also, we want to hear your story, and I don't know how you feel. You've got to make me understand how you feel. And part of the amping up was not only giving them lots of booze and having them stay up all night and partying, and then, but as the literal only former guest that we hear from talks about, like that was her experience. But there is also this appeal to, I want to know your story. I want to know who you are.
Yeah.
You have to tell me who you are, and you have to make that clear to me. But the whole time they are trying to ensure that they fight.
Yeah.
So they don't say that to them, though. There's not a sense of, you need to get out there and fight, at least that we are privy to. Like, who knows? But that's not what we see.
Well, we do see, they say you need to go back out there and confront him again.
Yeah.
Or we're not giving you a ticket home, which apparently was like a common strategy.
Right.
Which an idea is like, eventually you're going to put them in a position where either they are going to get so mad, you're stressing them out so much such that they will get this emotional response, or that they recognize what's being asked of them, even if you don't say it.
Which only works if they're poor. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
I think, in relation to something called cults and something that we understand inside of that just
Right.
sociological genre of group formation. I'm thinking about what you said about the Real Housewives and about how we follow these people's arcs as characters, whether that's real or fake or something else entirely.
Yeah.
We are interested in seeing what happens to this one. Like with Jerry Springer, there are communities being forged for sure as an audience, and again, like Jerry Springer himself as the ringleader, or as the bus driver that's taking the trip to the zoo.
That's right.
But that kind of group formation that is happening among the audience of the show, okay, it comes at the cost of the people that they are looking at, is one thing. But then it's happening very much for the profit of Jerry Springer and Richard Dominic, who to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year and extended contracts.
Which is why the Oprah comparison, I think, is super problematic, because like Oprah has, it's like, if we want to do the what's the cult in all of this, like the comparison of Springer to Oprah, even though Springer actually surpasses her in viewership at one point, is this idea that like that's the bad talk show that's not doing it right. Oprah offers community. Oprah offers a book club, right? Like Katie Lofton's book on Oprah goes into all of this, that the way that it uses the television.
What is that book?
Oprah, Gospel of an Icon.
Okay.
And use the idea that there is a kind of community of audiences watching this, and they're reading the magazine, and they're engaged in the book club.
Sure.
And Springer doesn't have all of that institution, but all of that stuff that we think of as being like perhaps beneficial is still there to make Oprah money.
Oh, sure.
Right.
And I would say that Springer absolutely has a community that is very much devoted. They just don't, maybe have a book club or whatever.
Right.
Like one of the things that I learned from it was that chant of Jerry was not something that emerged or evolved as the show got more popular. It was something that Dominic came up with when it was unpopular, to make the people at home think that this guy is popular.
Yeah.
So it was something that sort of spoke itself into existence. And so it's all community formation.
Yeah.
It's all group solidarity under the leadership of someone that we can rally around and take our cues from.
Right.
And so whether that is, Oprah recommending a book to read, or Jerry Springer, with his kind of like plausible deniability of I'm just here not to judge and offer a stage for free speech. But then we'll also, kind of whatever, like say to the white supremacists, like, we're laughing at you because we know you're stupid. And I mean, he'll, kind of poke at the guests as well because he's one of us.
Yeah.
Right. The same phenomenon that we point to and call cult when there is a ingredient deemed religious inside of it is the same phenomenon that is at play in all of these. I mean, I think that it's interesting the fact that I don't know. I mean, the fact that there is even a book whose subtitle is The Gospel of an Icon means that, that what Lofton is identifying is a phenomenon that is, I mean, I have questions about like using words like gospel and things, but that's okay. My only point is just this phenomenon is one that I think has a lot of comparative traction inside of all of these different domains. And but yeah, I don't know. Like I'm thinking now of like what it would be like what would a book read like if it were Jerry Springer, The Gospel of an Icon, you know?
Well, it wouldn't be. It'd be Jerry Springer, the cult of obscenity or whatever, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that would that would be what it
Yeah.
is, right? It would be the
Interesting.
argument would be,
That makes sense.
yeah,
Sure.
but at the end of the day, like the other side of this is the reason Jerry Springer stayed on the air was because Jerry Springer was bringing in ratings, which is
Mhm.
bringing in money for all
Mhm. Mhm.
and it was only when the ratings dipped
Mhm.
that there was, that things
Yeah.
got canceled. And so it's
Yeah.
to me, it's like it is amazing how much just the ability to make a lot of money absolves you for like that.
Sure.
That's what made it possible.
Sure. Jerry Springer was a show that punched down. You know, you could say that the show as a just ratings phenomenon was something that punched a hole
Mhm.
in the architecture of corporate media and like toppled the power I don't know.
Yeah.
But the people who were fighting, the people in the ring,
Yeah.
so to speak, were always we're never corporate executives
Yeah.
or, people at the top of a pyramid scheme or hedge fund managers who were treating their employees like shit. Like it's always, this single mom from wherever
Uh-huh.
is going to confront her ex-boyfriend's new mistress. And here's a like story of incest, or here's a like it's the magnifying glass is always directed at people who are in a position that is more vulnerable than
Yeah.
that of the audience.
Yes.
And I think that that's part of what makes a kind of distinction
Yeah.
for me with something like, what John Waters is up to, or
Well,
camp in general,
yeah.
or like,
Well,
yeah.
And it does it in the name of actually helping and or standing up for those people. Like the argument
Yeah.
that Springer and Dominic are making is like, we're giving these people a chance. They have nowhere else to go to tell their story, and we're giving them that.
We may not be trying to help them, but we are giving them at least a chance to tell their story. Right,
and it is more like a televangelist that, is drawing money from a similar demographic in the name of healing them or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where you have a community, you have people who have real needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start, Robert Tilton or whomever, they start calling the 1-800 number and they start getting stuff in the mail, and then they start giving money and they start getting more and more money. That is more the model, or even some of the MLM, the women we've seen in these MLMs, like, LuLaRoe or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's comparisons there. To what's going on.
I mean, I guess that's my takeaway too. Is it like, so at one point when he's testifying before a hearing about violence on the show, Jerry says, "It's a television show. We will all survive it." And I mean, I take his point. Like I think that I mean, John Waters certainly is not the only person who is up to this kind of business. I think that there are a lot of people one might point to, but like the idea of there is mainstream traditional values that are imposed from these kinds of power structures, and we should intervene, and we can make art that is called base or trashy or junk or whatever. Like there's actually some really interesting social commentary to make inside of those spaces.
Yeah.
I think that's a very different thing than, I guess, what the Springer show. So my problem is not that it's trash or that it's gross, or like, I mean, there's a total place for that. I think a really important place for that. So I dig his point that like it's a TV show, we'll all survive it.
Right.
Sure. I guess where it gets tricky for me is when people's lives become TV and vice versa. So maybe it's a question of genre again. Maybe that's kind of the thing that I keep kind of coming back to with all of these conversations. Because it's not about high and low or respectability and debasement so much as power and privilege, you know, because what's allowed in one genre is not allowed in another. It's in fact what we want to make sure is disallowed in another, except when the people are ones that society doesn't care about.
Right.
And then their lives can absolutely be TV.
Right.
Because then anything goes and we don't care.
Yeah. No, I think my takeaway is,
and I think maybe that's the difference too between like the Real Housewives, because they're not, I might not envy a fight with my friends at a dinner table.
Yeah.
But I'm never going to eat a dinner that costs what one of their brunches does. Like,
right.
And so it's just a totally different thing.
I think it's, for me, part of it is about who's in on it. Like who is in on it. And insofar now there have been lawsuits against Bravo by Real Housewives for production techniques or whatever. There have been lawsuits in Love is Blind as well. But I do think there is a greater understanding of being in on it on those shows, whereas the guests on Springer were never expected to be in on it.
Right.
And the audience actually is in on it in a way.
Right.
And that, to me, I think is another way to talk about that power imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think like the Springer triangle, I think Toby at the end of the documentary, the producer, gets it right. Where he says like, we made this thing because there is a, like, he looks at the camera, he's like, you're making a documentary about this because people are going to see Jerry Springer when they flip through Netflix and want to watch this.
Right.
Just like we knew when we made our show, people were going to be flipping through the channels and stop and watch it. So there's something there.
And the fact that the questions that you're asking me are always about the fights and the incest and the racism and the this, like it's all about that stuff. And so you are the thing that you're trying to interview.
As you often say, like he's making that same point that I think you make on our show a lot about we are all implicated in this. And even the PTC or any of the protest groups, like they needed Jerry Springer to get themselves over. They needed Jerry Springer to have a reason to be on television, like to be on the news, right? And so I think that's one piece of it. And then the second piece for me is like, another thing we come back to all the time, like there are systemic failures, especially in places like the Springer Triangle. And those systemic failures produce individuals that can be exploited for their fascination.
Right.
And rather than talk about what is going on in southern Ohio to eastern Tennessee to North Georgia, it's easier to just chalk it all up to individual pathology. And so it was a show about the internal others of American society, much the same way cult documentaries that we think of as more cult documentaries are produced for another audience to gawk at.
We talked at some point, I forget in what conversation, about, or I mean, you were very kind and I talked about, you were kind to listen to me talk about why I think the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development are just pure gold. And then the last episode, like not the reboot, but you know, when it kind of came back as a Netflix series, I couldn't watch it because it went from like the object, like the characters that we're looking at and kind of poking at in the first 3 seasons are these gazillionaires who are completely oblivious to the world spinning outside of them. And so the internal dynamics of like, here's $20, go buy a Star Wars or whatever, go see a Star Wars, go see a Star Wars, is like, you know, how much must a banana cost? $8? Like like that, that kind of, it is a completely different joke than it is when they lose all of their money and we're supposed to still find them funny. I think that the power dynamics invert that completely. And so it's why Jerry Springer never worked for me and Howard Stern never worked for me, because the joke is at the expense of people who are already marginalized.
Yes.
But then John Waters does work for me because the joke is on mainstream moralistic Americana that would seek to marginalize.
Yeah.
You know?
No,
and
I think
his
that's right.
is a talking back to that.
Yes. This is a good segue to why, when we get to Mr. McMahon, why I never liked the WWF.
Ooh.
Growing up in the South. So,
well, speaking of the South, Michael.
Yes.
May I say that my cult favorite is, so, you know, we lost Nikki Giovanni, the brilliant, incredible poet, just a few months ago. And she was from Knoxville, Tennessee, which is a place very near and dear to my own heart. And so I am going to send you a link that I hope will work, that will allow people to hear her reading a poem called Tennessean by Birth. And she wrote a lot of poems. I mean, she has also a poem called Knoxville, Tennessee that I think is really beautiful. But this one that begins, I'm a native Tennessean, I was born there, really takes you on this journey that very much lives inside Appalachia and also takes account of all of the power dynamics that exist therein from the perspective of someone who is not sitting inside of the locus of power. Yeah. So it's really beautiful. Read everything she ever wrote, but she's got a lot to say about Appalachia and a very different perspective on what one might call, or otherwise, the Springer Triangle.
That's really good. So,
what's your cult favorite?
So my cult favorite is, so we mentioned Emily Nagoski in our last episode when we were talking about One Taste.
Yep.
She has a lovely Substack, and in that Substack, a day or two after we recorded that episode, I received an email, a guest post from Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens, who's got a new book called Good Sex that just came out. The article is titled Good Sex as Food for the Revolution. And it's I think it's just a really great piece. I'm not going to try to summarize the whole thing. People should go read it. We'll put a link in the show notes. But it's an argument that she's making for a connection between what she calls intimate justice and social justice.
Okay.
And that sort of individual sexual liberation is a necessary piece of taking social justice action out in the world. So it's an interesting, and it's all framed for her in the article within the kind of current political moment that we're in. In a moment when we might think that what's most important is getting out there and doing stuff, that in fact, that this sort of intimate justice she's talking about is as important, if not more important, considering the deluge of anxiety-inducing everything that we run into on a regular basis right now. So
yeah, okay,
I'll
check that out.
I recommend it. It was interesting.
I don't think that this is a recommendation, but I should just very, very quickly point out that there is a book coming out in, I don't know, eminently, like it's this year, it's this spring. Ross Bennis. It's called 1999, the year low culture conquered America and kickstarted our bizarre times. And I think that Vince McMahon and Jerry Springer, you know, are the cartoonish renderings of them, I think, make the cover. I'm not sure. But they've both very much featured inside of it. I think that it's I haven't read it yet. I've only, like seen reviews of it and stuff, but I think it's pertinent to this conversation. I think that the idea of our times being deemed bizarre is kind of one of the things that I find fascinating about this whole thing, because it's not that it's low culture and we're weird. Like, I think that art and substance live very much on both high and low ends of the spectrum.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But I think that so I'm curious to see to what extent he does or does not get into the power dynamics that I do think are important to make distinctions about.
1999.
So I'll link that too. But it's not, if it's super problematic, then I don't want to call it a it's not a recommendation. I haven't read it.
It's
but
yeah,
pertinent to this conversation.
We'll wait for a couple of reviews to come out.
That's right.
Fully endorse. Endorse something you haven't read. Never a good sign. Thanks for listening, everybody. Endorse our show by subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review and a rating, because you've actually listened to the episode now, so you can say how great it was. And you can follow us on the socials at Cult Favorite Pod. But we'd also love to hear from you. You can DM us or leave a comment on this episode in Spotify. Special thanks to the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama for production assistance. And special thanks to the Religion and Cultures Master's Program in that department. It's a program that equips students both for, analytical, academic communication stuff and digital skills like making podcasts. So check that out. We will be back in 2 weeks, and I think we're going to talk about Mr. McMahon.
Yeah, we are.
So that'll be something.
It'll be something. Think of it as a part 2 to this conversation that doesn't require you're listening to the first part or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's gonna. Well, you've already listened to the first part.
Well, the people think right now.
It's going to be an exercise in restraint by me to let. Oh,
I'm so excited.
Gush all my thoughts.
Well, I tend to talk way more than you do, I think. So this will be a chance where I can listen. I can practice my listening skills.
No, I want to hear what you're thinking. I'm like, I don't. I've got a normie to get the reaction from.
I've got a normie. I've been called a lot of things in my life, Michael Altman. Normie is not one of them. So.
All right, we will see the rest of you normies
Bye.
next week. 2 weeks.